Hey everyone, today we are having Jeff from Chroma as our guest for the webinar. So we'll start with a brief introduction and then going to use cases around generative AI for financial services and discuss a bit more about Chroma as well, like how do they fit in and so on. So why don't we start with a brief introduction, Jeff, from your side, and then I'll follow.
Sounds great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Huber. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Chroma. Chroma is an open source vector database commonly used by what are kind of emergingly called AI engineers to build applications with language models on top of their data. So oftentimes when organizations want to bring AI into their organization, the first thing they think to do is to create, for example, a chatbot over my data. And the over my data bridge is what Chroma enables as a vector database. I'm sure we'll get much more into the details around this during the call today, but it's a quick introduction to me. The team is based here in San Francisco, and we've raised a little over $20 million now from a bunch of very high-profile investors and angel investors in the Bay Area.
It's awesome. So about me, for those who are not aware of what we do, so I'm Varun from NayaOne. I currently lead the marketplace within the platform. My role is primarily looking at different technologies and see how our financial institutional clients can collaborate and accelerate their partnerships. So yeah, that's a bit about me. And right, Jeff, I guess we can kickstart with a few questions around generative AI as a whole. So you mentioned chatbot and other enterprises and engineers using GPT or other large language models to build like very good applications on top of it. Um, so can you maybe expand on these cases that you're seeing currently in the market and maybe dive into a bit deeper on how Chroma could be relevant in those use cases?
Mm-hmm. In broad strokes, what we're observing is a new wave of software. So genuinely a new generation of how software is written is happening right now. And the use cases that we're seeing emerge today are in some ways the obvious use cases and the tip of the spear use cases. So in the same way, when the web came around, what did everybody do? We put newspapers on the internet. It's kind of something we were already doing. We just did it in a better way. It was obvious. That's essentially where the market is at today for generative AI. So there's a bunch of use cases which I think are exciting about. They're very exciting and are coming down the pipe. But today, far and away, the things that most organizations are doing to get their feet wet is to do these use cases called retrieval augmented generation. So the idea here is you want to take the raw sort of reasoning horsepower that a language model provides, and you want to do something useful in your organization. Oftentimes, that useful thing is providing a natural language question answering type interaction. So very similar to ChatGPT, but over an organization's knowledge corpus. Now that could be an internal knowledge base. Generically, it could be an internal HR knowledge base. It could be a customer support kind of public facing knowledge base. But this type of use case is, again, one that's very common in the sense that it's not too difficult actually to build and get good results. And so we've seen a lot of organizations now build, again, retrieval augmented generation, this idea of being able to chat your data with a vector database and with a language model. And those are the only two tools you need. You need a language model, which now there are obviously good closed source options like GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 from OpenAI. But this past week, Llama 2 open source model from Facebook came out really good and very good for a lot of these sort of like information processing tasks that businesses face. Llama 2 is not as good at coding as GPT 3.5, GPT 4, but I think to like financial tech customers, that's probably a little bit less relevant.
Yeah.
And so it's an incredibly exciting time to be building. I think, even basically this week, you can take Llama 2, you can take Chroma, both are open source solutions, and you can deploy them inside your firewall and get compelling applications today. So the timing is could not be better.
That's so true. That's so true. And I think on one of the points that you mentioned, right, like retrieval augmentation, and so currently what we are seeing on our side is also like, a lot of financial services companies and enterprises are looking at how they can enable both internally and externally the engagement. There are a lot of documents and this, as you said, like different knowledge bases, right? And each team could find it relevant. And there's a lot of information and like basically question answers that they could extract out of those documents. Very generic use case, I'd say. And there's also the other use case, right? So this fine tuning, for example. So how do you think institutions and enterprises should, choose which way they should go, whether it be fine tuning or is it RAG?
Yeah, there's sort of three options when it comes to building a production application with AI in the loop. You can train your own foundation model from scratch, which I think is likely not the path forward for almost every single company on Earth. It's extremely rare that you'd want to do that. Maybe the only cases that you'd want to do that are maybe you're wanting to build a model that knows about, speaks the language of proteins, not the language of English. And so in that case, sure, train your own foundation model from scratch. GPT-4 doesn't speak proteins in the way that you need it to. So what that leaves us with is both fine tuning and then retrieval. Retrieval meaning using a vector database to be able to dynamically load knowledge and information into the brain of the large language model. The analogy that I use sometimes is like, for those who've seen the movie The Matrix, when Neo is laying on this bed and Tank hooks up his brain and then downloads information into his brain, and he says the famous line, "I know Kung Fu." That is essentially what is happening with retrieval. Tank is using retrieval to load the knowledge of Kung Fu into the brain of the language model embodied by Neo in this analogy. So when it comes to reasoning about when we should use fine tuning versus when we should use retrieval, I think it's a good question. Retrieval, so just to lay out kind of quickly maybe the pros and cons. So fine tuning is time consuming, is expensive, is hard to evaluate. Retrieval is sort of nearly instant. It is deterministic, so it is ultimately just a database that any engineer can go and look at. And it is updatable instantaneously. It's just like any other database. You can just update a record and it works right away. So maybe more the question is, I think retrieval has to be in the loop no matter what. You can do maybe fine tuning and retrieval. There's almost no reason to not be using retrieval. Retrieval is a mandatory tool to build a production AI application in today's world. The question then becomes, even at a minimum, because you want up-to-date information. At a minimum, because you want up-to-date information, you want a developer to be able to go into and surgically update the AI's knowledge and have that be instantly represented. A potentially multi-week time lag of fine-tuning is not acceptable for enterprises to build those sorts of experiences. So you need to have retrieval. The question then becomes, when is fine-tuning appropriate? I think that it's still early to be able to have exact guidance around this. At the broadest sense, what I would encourage enterprises to think about is when you're doing fine-tuning, you're not teaching the language model to know a particular thing. You're teaching it to think in a specific way. And so in some sense, you're teaching it to speak lawyerese or doctorese or, I don't know, accountantese maybe. And so if you can characterize the problem you're trying to solve, and you think that there's a certain level of easing necessary enough from normal spoken English or normal spoken language, then it may make sense to fine tune. But I think that by default, the first step should be using retrieval and then evaluate that, benchmark that, then consider whether fine tuning and being able to get the language model to speak in ease can get you to that next step that you needed to get to.
Yeah, that's very spot on, I'd say. And it's also very much about, the ease and familiarity as well, right? Like for fine tuning, as you said, there's a lot of um, extra setup and additional requirements when compared to retrieval augmentation, perhaps. That's really a good point. And oh, very interesting. So
In the case of something like GPT-3 or GPT-4, again from OpenAI, GPT 3.5, I think has a fine-tuning endpoint right now. It requires you to upload your data to OpenAI.
yeah,
And you have certain policies and things that make it seem like, and I think this is probably true, that their data they handle data securely, they delete data, they have all those right compliances. But again, for financial organizations who are rightfully so very conservative about where they send data, even that may not be enough. And then you have open source models like Llama 2 that just came out. But again, the fine tuning story around that is incredibly early, requires specialized people in the team in the organization to be able to do the fine
yeah,
tuning. And even then, there's this disadvantage where if you take today's Llama 2 and you fine tune it to do something well, the main line of development for Llama 2 will continue forward. And so, Llama 2 may get much better and better and better because the community continues to make it better and better. But now all of a sudden
yeah,
you fine tune on the old version. And so then you kind of have to be continually updating it by going to the new version. So I think that for a lot of these reasons, it's just very dynamic. And so fine tuning should be the last thing organizations consider in most cases. Again, there are some exceptions around things like lawyerese or doctorese,
yeah,
etc. But for anything that's mimics spoken English, where an average human can read it and it looks like it makes
yeah.
sense at a minimum, I think that probably the base models can handle it just fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that leads me to my next question around open source in financial services. So recently Llama 2 came out, and yeah, there's a lot of debate around the model as well, whether if it's open source or not. But keeping that aside, like open source in general in financial services, like how do you see that evolve? Because financial services at the end of it are very regulated, and even when we see our clients exploring generative AI use cases, there's a lot of discussion around privacy and masking guardrails and so on. So
Yeah.
given this context, how do you see open source in generative AI in financial services?
Yeah, I think that when financial services organizations are considering tools to bring into the organization, they want to have security, privacy, uh, tenancy, and auditing guarantees over the services that they're bringing in. And that's a very difficult thing to do with traditional closed source SaaS offerings. Um, not only that, I think that financial services organizations often take quite a long view of the kinds of technology that they're delivering to end users. And having continuation of service is also quite important. So building mission critical services on closed sourced SaaS startups that might go underwater, go belly up the next year is not exactly an acceptable path. Even more than that, making sure the tool itself and the code itself has all the security patches and is up to date for CVEs and other code security things is also incredibly important. And having the visibility into that. And so, I think that for financial service organizations, open source is really the only viable path to building these sorts of applications, and closed source simply does not cut it. Now, again, maybe you can make closed source work if you go through 18 months or 24 months of a review cycle and process and executive sign off, et cetera. But I think
Yeah,
most developers, in these organizations don't necessarily want to do that. The ROI is not there. It's not worth it. The closed source solutions are in many cases worse than the open source solutions anyways. And so again, it just doesn't make sense. One thing that Chroma is thinking about probably offering next calendar year, so quite some time out yet, but maybe not that long in the timelines of a lot of the organizations we're talking about here, is our own hosted offering for enterprises. And one of the things that we're taking very seriously and thinking a lot about is making sure that the data that organizations have does not need to leave their firewall ever. And in the public clouds that organizations already have, if you have any load on AWS, Azure, or GCP, Chroma will work inside of those environments natively. And again, your data never has to leave, but you still get a fully managed experience, which again, obviously, again, you're thinking about like staffing and resources. You don't necessarily want to have to recruit and dedicate multiple engineers to managing a service and keeping it up. And so that's something that we're thinking about very critically here in the next 12 to 18 months. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I think probably a lot of institutions would find that very helpful. If the data doesn't leave their premises, I think security and compliance are happy and the data as well. So yeah, very much looking forward to that, I guess.
Yeah, you also get tenancy guarantees. So if your data has to remain in EU on EU servers, that's fine.
Yeah,
If you need multiple deployments for EU and US customers, that's fine. Again, all the auditing logs over who's accessing what data continues to be fine. Today we don't have necessarily a full what I would call auth story for
mm,
granular row level authentication to say, hey, this user has access to this data, etc. But it's certainly something on our roadmap, something we're thinking about. And so, enterprise readiness I think is really important. And again, I think if you consider certainly the trade-off between open source and closed source, for any enterprise who wants to make a long-term decision and wants to pick a tool which is going to be stable in the organization, which is really important. We're obviously building anything with financial services. I think open source is certainly the way to go.
awesome. Do you have any questions for me? I ran out of questions for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear what you're seeing inside of organizations adopting generative AI. What kinds of use cases are people building, and what kinds of challenges are they running into?
Yeah, I think starting with the use cases that you mentioned, right? So a lot of the use cases are related to the data that's already there, be it documents in structured or unstructured. So with unstructured, you see like a lot of documents or like data that's very much you know towards the customer experience and how do you improve or retail or commercial customer experience. So there's a lot of ongoing experiments and use cases there. And on the other side, you also see, like for in insurance, for example, there are a number of insurers who are exploring how generative AI could be useful for underwriting even. So accelerating that process of onboarding a customer is one other use case that we see. And internally, I think there's a lot of use cases that are coming around how can we provision applications that could be relevant for different business units within the organization? So generative AI, I think it's kind of like pan organization. So at every business point, at every level, there's a number of use cases that could be relevant for the teams. So there again, like we see how can we improve that back office operations and so on and so forth. So broadly, I'd say document data oriented use cases and then domain specific, probably customer experience and back office operations. And on the other side, there's still emerging use cases around fraud detection. So let's see where that goes.
Mhm.
But very exciting times, I'd say, especially with financial institutions right now. It's yeah, it's amazing. Cool.
Awesome, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Well, I guess that we covered pretty much the key points that we wanted to. So one last question from me would be, what's your last ask from whoever's listening to our webinar?
Yeah, depending on your role, I'd, encourage you or you're the engineer on your team or your friendly engineer to go check out the project. So the project is called Chroma. That's CHROMA, and the URL is trychroma.com. So trychroma.com. Um, Chroma routinely, I think it gets a lot of love from the community on the accessibility and ease of getting started. You can build a small experiment in probably even just a few hours. You can really get something working and get something working pretty well. And so definitely encourage folks to check that out. Give us a GitHub star, give us a Twitter follow, and join the community.
Awesome. Yeah. And for those listeners who are already on the platform, you can always spin up a testing environment and yeah, play around with Chrome as well on the platform. So awesome. I guess that concludes our webinar.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for taking your time. Hopefully speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Varun. Appreciate it. Have a good day.